Frank Miller had been on Earth for all of 3 days when the trouble started. After 30 years serving in the Galactic Security Forces, the last 15 as a detective working on cases between different alien species, he had finally retired with a good pension and a wish for peace and quiet. Earth, the planet his family came from though he had never actually lived there, seemed like the perfect place to settle down. The land he bought online was in a quiet part of Montana, far from the busy spaceports and government centers where he had spent his career. The website had shown 50 acres of beautiful land with a small cabin, perfect for a man who wanted nothing more than to fish, hike, and maybe raise a few horses. What the website did not mention was that the land was next to a new housing development called Starlight Meadows, which had its own homeowners association. Frank was still unpacking his boxes when he heard a knock at his door. When he opened it, he found a woman with perfect blonde hair wearing expensive-looking workout clothes that did not show any signs of actual exercise. "Hello," she said with a big fake smile. "I'm Nancy Peterson, president of the Starlight Meadows Homeowners Association. We saw you moved in recently and wanted to welcome you to the area." Frank shook her hand. "Frank Miller, nice to meet you," Nancy's smile did not reach her eyes as she looked past him into the cabin. "I also wanted to give you a copy of our community rules. Even though your land is not officially part of our development, we have certain expectations for nearby properties." Frank took the thick binder she pushed toward him. "Thank you for the welcome, but my land is not part of your HOA. Nancy's smile got tighter. "We're all neighbors here, Mr. Miller. How nearby properties look directly affects our home values. I'm sure you understand." Frank had dealt with enough entitled officials and business executives to know when someone was trying to push him around. "I'll look at this," he said, without promising anything. "But I should be clear. I bought this land specifically because it is not under any rules or restrictions. Just read the materials," Nancy said, still smiling. "I'll come back next week to see if you have any questions." She turned and walked back to her fancy hover SUV, which was parked at the end of his gravel driveway. Frank closed the door and tossed the binder onto his kitchen counter without opening it. After moving boxes and building furniture all day, he was too tired to deal with whatever nonsense was inside. He had no idea that this simple meeting was about to grow into a much bigger problem. The next morning, Frank woke up early with the sun. He made a strong cup of coffee and stepped out onto his porch to enjoy the view. The land around his cabin was mostly flat, with tall grass waving in the gentle breeze. In the distance, he could see the mountains, their peaks still capped with snow even though it was late spring. "This is what I've been waiting for," he said to himself, taking a deep breath of the clean mountain air. After decades of living on crowded space stations and noisy ships, the silence was almost shocking. Frank spent the day exploring his new land. He walked the entire border, noting the places where his property met the Starlight Meadows development. The houses there were all identical. Large white buildings with perfect lawns and not a single item out of place. They looked sterile and lifeless compared to the wild beauty of his land. In the afternoon, Frank drove his old truck into town to buy supplies. Pinewood was a small community about 20 minutes from his cabin. It had one main street with basic stores, a grocery, a hardware store, a diner, and a few other businesses. Frank liked it immediately. The people were friendly but minded their own business, exactly what he was looking for. At the hardware store, Frank bought tools and materials to fix up the cabin. It was sturdy but needed work, new roof panels, better insulation, and updated plumbing for starters. "Planning some big projects?" asked the store owner, a gray-haired man named Pete. "Just making my place livable," Frank replied. "Previous owner let it get a bit run down," Pete nodded knowingly. "Old Johnson's place, right? Out by the new development?" "That's the one." Pete frowned slightly. "Already met the Starlight Meadows folks, have you?" Frank raised an eyebrow. "Met their HOA president yesterday, Nancy Peterson." Pete let out a low whistle. "Watch yourself with that one. She's been trying to buy up all the land around that development. Gets mighty upset when people don't want to sell." "I noticed," Frank said dryly. "She left me a binder of rules she expects me to follow even though my land isn't part of their HOA." Sounds like Nancy, Pete laughed. She moved here from the city about 3 years ago. Thinks she can turn this whole area into some kind of fancy suburb. Frank thanked Pete for the warning and finished his shopping. As he drove back to his cabin, he thought about what Pete had said. It seemed Nancy Peterson had a reputation in town, and not a good one. When Frank got back to his cabin, he noticed fresh tire tracks in his driveway that hadn't been there when he left. Someone had been on his property while he was gone. He carefully looked around the cabin, but nothing seemed to be missing or disturbed. Still, the thought of someone snooping around his home made him uneasy. That evening, as the sun was setting, Frank sat on his porch with a glass of whiskey. In the distance, he could see the lights of Starlight Meadows coming on one by one. They formed a perfect grid, so different from the natural darkness of his land. Frank pulled out his old service pistol from its case and checked it carefully. Decades of working in dangerous places had taught him to be prepared. He didn't expect trouble, but Nancy Peterson's visit and the mysterious tire tracks had put him on alert. "Just want to be left alone," he muttered as he put the pistol away, again. "Is that too much to ask?" As if in answer, an owl hooted from a nearby tree. Frank smiled and raised his glass in a toast to the bird. Maybe this really would be the peaceful retirement he had dreamed of for so long. Little did he know that Nancy Peterson was at that very moment in her large house at the center of Starlight Meadows, looking at satellite images of his property and making plans that would disrupt his peace in ways he could not imagine. A week passed, and Frank settled into a nice routine on his new land. He woke with the sun each morning, hiked around his property, worked on fixing up his cabin during the day, and watched the sunset from his porch with a glass of whiskey each night. For the first time in 30 years, he felt the tension leaving his body. Frank started to make plans for his land. He wanted to build a stable for horses on the far side of his property. He had always loved horses as a child, seeing them in old videos about Earth. During his years traveling between stars, he had promised himself that one day he would have a few horses of his own. On Monday morning, Frank began marking the area where he would build the stable. He drove wooden stakes into the ground and tied bright orange string between them to outline the building. He was just finishing when he heard the sound of a hover SUV coming up his driveway. Nancy Peterson's vehicle stopped near the cabin, kicking up dust as it landed. She stepped out wearing a white pantsuit that looked too fancy for a visit to a ranch. 2 men in business suits followed her. "Mr. Miller," she called out, walking toward him with quick, angry steps. "What do you think you're doing?" Frank stood up straight and wiped sweat from his face. "Building a stable for horses." Nancy's face twisted like she had smelled something bad. "Absolutely not. Didn't you read the rules I gave you? No farm animals within view of Starlight Meadows homes. The smell would be terrible." "Ms. Peterson," Frank said calmly, using the same voice he had used when talking down angry aliens with weapons. "As I told you before, my property is not part of your HOA. I have every right to build a stable and keep horses here." "This is not acceptable," Nancy said, her voice getting higher. "The county has rules about noise and smells. We will file complaints." Frank knew she was lying. Before buying the property, he had checked all local rules about keeping animals. "Feel free to check with the county. This land is classified as farmland. Horses are allowed here." One of the men with Nancy stepped forward. "I'm Greg Butler, the treasurer of Starlight Meadows HOA. We are willing to be reasonable, Mr. Miller. We would consider buying your property for a fair price." Frank almost laughed. "It's not for sale." "Everyone has a price," Nancy said with a smug smile. "And trust me, we can make things very hard for you if you insist on this country lifestyle." The threat was clear, but Frank had faced down space pirates and corrupt officials in his career. A suburban HOA president didn't scare him at all. "I appreciate your concern for my property," he said evenly. "But this conversation is over. Please don't come onto my land again without permission." Nancy's face turned red. "This isn't over, Mr. Miller. Not by a long shot." As they walked back to their vehicle, Frank noticed Nancy taking pictures of his property with her comm device. He sighed. In his experience, petty officials were the same across the galaxy. Give them a little power, and they think they rule the universe. After they left, Frank went back to work. He needed to clear the area of rocks and level the ground before he could start building. The physical work felt good after years of desk duty. By evening, his muscles ached in a satisfying way, and he had made good progress. The next morning, Frank was eating breakfast when he heard another vehicle coming up his driveway. This time it was a county truck. Two men in uniforms got out and approached his door. "Mr. Miller?" one of them said when Frank opened the door. "We're from the county environmental office. We received a complaint about illegal land clearing on this property." Frank invited them in and showed them his permits. "Everything is in order," he explained. "I'm just preparing to build a small stable, all approved by the county last week." The officials checked his paperwork and nodded. "Looks fine to us," one said. "Sorry to bother you. We have to check every complaint." "Let me guess," Frank said. "The complaint came from Starlight Meadows?" The men looked uncomfortable. "We can't say who filed the complaint," one said, but his expression told Frank all he needed to know. After they left, Frank made a call to the county offices. He needed to know what he was up against. The clerk on the other end of the line was helpful. "Oh, the Peterson woman," she said when Frank explained the situation. "She files complaints every week about someone. Most of them are nothing, but we have to check them all." "Is there anything I can do to stop this?" Frank asked. "Document everything," the clerk advised. "If she's harassing you, you might be able to get a restraining order." Frank thanked her and hung up. He had dealt with bureaucracy across the galaxy. Earth's version was no different. He would need to be patient and follow the rules. That afternoon, Frank drove into town to buy building supplies. He ordered lumber, roofing materials, and everything else he would need for the stable. The store owner, Pete, promised to deliver it all the next day. "Still having trouble with the Starlight Meadows crowd?" Pete asked as he wrote up the order. Frank nodded. "Nancy Peterson seems determined to stop me from building a stable." Pete shook his head. "She's been a problem since she moved here. Tried to get the town council to pass all kinds of new rules. Wanted to ban tractors on the main road because they're unsightly. Can you believe that? In a farming town." On his way home, Frank stopped at the local diner for lunch. As he ate his burger, he noticed people looking at him and whispering. Finally, an older woman came over to his table. "You're the new fellow who bought the old Johnson place, aren't you?" she asked. Frank nodded. "Frank Miller." "I'm Betty. I own this diner," she said, sitting down across from him. "Word is that Nancy Peterson is giving you a hard time." "News travels fast," Frank said. Betty smiled. "Small town. Listen, Nancy's been trying to push people around since she got here. Most folks just give in because they don't want the trouble. It's good to see someone standing up to her." When Frank got back to his property, he found another county truck parked in his driveway. This time it was a noise control officer. "Got a complaint about construction noise," the officer said, looking embarrassed. "But I don't hear anything." Frank smiled. "That's because I haven't started building yet. The materials aren't even here." The officer shook his head. "Sorry to waste your time, sir. I have to check every complaint." That night, Frank sat on his porch and looked at the stars. They seemed closer here than they had on any of the space stations or ships where he had lived. He thought about his years as a detective, solving crimes across the galaxy. He had faced dangerous criminals, navigated complex alien politics, and survived more than one shootout. Now, in his retirement, he was being harassed by a woman who thought she owned the town because she was president of a small homeowners association. Frank laughed out loud at the absurdity of it. Nancy Peterson had no idea who she was dealing with. If she wanted a fight, he would give her one. But he would do it his way, following the rules, building his case step by step, just like he had done as a detective. In the distance, he could see the lights of Starlight Meadows. Somewhere in that perfect grid of identical houses, Nancy Peterson was probably filing another complaint about him. Frank smiled and raised his glass in a mock toast. "Bring it on," he said to the night. The next morning, the building supplies for Frank's stable arrived. Two large hover trucks pulled up to his property and began unloading stacks of lumber, roofing materials, and bags of concrete. Frank directed the workers where to place everything, feeling excited about starting the actual building work. He had just signed for the delivery when another vehicle came up his driveway. This time it was a black county car with official markings. Two people got out wearing uniforms with county badges. They introduced themselves as building inspectors. "We received a report of unauthorized construction," the taller inspector said. "We need to check your permits." Frank wasn't surprised. He calmly showed them all his paperwork, which he kept organized in a folder. "Everything seems to be in order," the inspector said after checking the documents. "Sorry to bother you, but we have to follow up on all complaints." "Let me guess," Frank said. "Nancy Peterson called you?" The inspectors looked at each other uncomfortably. "We can't say who made the complaint," the shorter one said, "but this is the third call about this property this week." As they were leaving, Frank noticed Nancy Peterson's hover SUV parked on the road at the edge of his property. She was watching, through the window, not even trying to hide. Over the next few days, Frank started building the foundation for his stable. He worked steadily, enjoying the physical labor, but every day brought a new interruption. First, it was wildlife officers checking for endangered species, then health inspectors concerned about possible contamination of the local water supply. Each time, Frank patiently showed his permits and explained his plans, and each time the officials left satisfied that everything was legal. Frank began documenting each visit with his comm device, recording the conversations and taking pictures of the officials and their vehicles. He also set up small security cameras around his property. If Nancy Peterson wanted to play games, he would be ready. One evening, as Frank was cleaning up his tools, he heard the familiar sound of Nancy's hover SUV approaching. This time, she had brought 5 other people with her. They stood in a group at the edge of his property, clearly trying to intimidate him. "Mr. Miller," Nancy called out, "the Starlight Meadows Community Board has voted. We are prepared to offer you 20% above market value for your property." Frank walked over to them, wiping his hands on a cloth. "As I've said before, my property is not for sale." One of the men, a thin man with a tight smile, stepped forward. "Mr. Miller, I'm Steve Watson, the Vice President of Starlight Meadows, HOA. Perhaps you don't understand the situation. Your activities are disrupting our community. The construction noise, the potential smells from animals, the decreased property values. It's unacceptable." "I understand perfectly," Frank replied. "I'm following all county regulations, my property, my rules." "We've been very patient," Nancy said, her voice cold. "But our patience has limits. Think carefully about our offer." Frank had heard enough. Threats in his career to recognize one when he heard it. "Is that a threat, Ms. Peterson?" "It's a reality," she replied. "Things can get very difficult for people who don't cooperate with the community." Frank took out his comm device and held it up. "I'm recording this conversation. Would you like to repeat what you just said?" Nancy's face turned red and she took a step back. "You can't record us without permission." "Actually, in this county, I can," Frank said calmly. "Single-party consent is all that's required, and I consent. Now, unless you have anything else to say, please leave my property. You're trespassing." The group retreated to their vehicle, but Nancy turned back at the last moment. "This isn't over, Miller, not by a long shot." Frank watched them leave, then went inside to add the recording to his growing file of evidence. He had learned as a detective that documentation was key in cases like this. The next morning, Frank woke up early as usual and went outside to continue his work. To his shock, he found that someone had knocked over his stacks of lumber during the night and spray-painted the word "Leave" on the foundation he had poured for the stable. Frank took pictures of the damage, then called the county sheriff's office to report the vandalism. A deputy came out an hour later to take his statement. "Any idea who might have done this?" the deputy asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. "I have my suspicions," Frank said. "I've been having trouble with the Starlight Meadows HOA. Their president, Nancy Peterson, has been trying to force me to sell my property." The deputy nodded. "Ms. Peterson has a reputation in the county. We've had other complaints about her and her association. I've been documenting everything," Frank said, showing the deputy his file of recordings and pictures. "Smart," the deputy said. "Keep doing that. If you get enough evidence, you might be able to get a restraining order." After the deputy left, Frank cleaned up the mess and got back to work. He refused to let the vandalism stop him. By evening, he had reset the lumber and repaired most of the damage. As the sun was setting, Frank sat on his porch with his usual glass of whiskey. The day had been difficult, but he wasn't going to give up. He had faced worse in his years as a galactic security detective. Just as he was finishing his drink, he heard sirens in the distance. They seemed to be getting closer. Frank stood up, watching as 3 police cars with flashing lights turned onto his driveway and sped toward his cabin. The cars screeched to a stop and 6 officers jumped out, their hands on their weapons. "Frank Miller?" one of them called out. "This is the county police. We need you to put your hands up and step away from the building." Frank slowly raised his hands. "What's this about, officers?" "We received a 911 call," the lead officer said, moving closer with caution. The caller reported seeing illegal weapons and possible explosive devices on this property. They specifically mentioned military-grade equipment. Frank almost laughed. This had to be Nancy Peterson's work. "Officers, I can explain. I'm a retired Galactic Security Forces detective. Badge number GS7729. I have 1 registered pulse pistol, which I'm licensed to carry. You're welcome to see my credentials." The officers looked uncertain. The lead officer spoke into his comm device, presumably checking Frank's claim. "We still need to search the property, sir," another officer said. "You'll need a warrant for that," Frank replied calmly. "But while we're waiting, I suggest you check who made that 911 call. I have a good idea who it was." The lead officer finished his call and approached Frank with a changed attitude. "Your credentials check out, Detective Miller, but we still have to investigate the weapons claim." "I understand," Frank said. "My service weapon is in a locked case inside. I'm happy to show you my permit." 2 officers went inside with Frank while the others waited outside. He showed them his pulse pistol, safely stored in a biometric lockbox, along with his permit and galactic security identification. "Everything seems in order," the officer said, clearly embarrassed. "I apologize for the disturbance." "No need to apologize," Frank said. "You're just doing your job, but I would like to know who made the call." The officer hesitated, then sighed. "The call came from a Nancy Peterson. She's made several calls about this property in the past week." Frank nodded. "I thought so. Filing a false police report is a serious offense, isn't it?" "Very serious," the officer agreed. "Especially when it involves claims about weapons. We take those calls very seriously." "I'd like to file for a restraining order," Frank said, "and I want to press charges for the false report and for the vandalism to my property." As the police were leaving, Frank noticed a familiar hover SUV parked down the road, its lights off. As the police cars passed it, the SUV quickly turned on its lights and drove away. Frank smiled grimly. Nancy Peterson had just made a very big mistake. In all her efforts to intimidate him, she had forgotten one important detail. He wasn't just a retired cop. He was a retired galactic security detective who had spent 15 years building cases against some of the most dangerous criminals in the galaxy. The real fight was just beginning. The morning after the police visit, Frank was drinking coffee on his porch when he heard a vehicle coming up his driveway. This wasn't Nancy's hover SUV, but a county sheriff's patrol car. A tall man with gray hair and a sheriff's uniform stepped out. "Detective Miller?" the man called. "I'm Sheriff Alan Watts. Got time to talk?" Frank nodded and invited him in. He offered the sheriff coffee, which he accepted. "Black, please," Sheriff Watts said as he looked around the cabin. "Nice place you've got here." "Thanks," Frank said, handing him the coffee. "It would be nicer if I could work on it without being interrupted every few hours." The sheriff smiled. "That's why I'm here. I read the report about last night's incident. False weapons complaint, Nancy Peterson." "Again," Frank raised an eyebrow. "Again? She's done this before," Sheriff Watts said, sipping his coffee. "Called in false reports on neighbors who wouldn't follow her rules. Never anything this serious, though. Weapons complaints are a whole different level." Frank sat down across from the sheriff. I've been documenting everything. The constant inspections, the threats, the vandalism, and now this. Smart, the sheriff nodded. But there's more to this than just an annoying HOA president. I did some checking into Ms. Peterson after I read the report. The sheriff pulled out a data pad and slid it across the table. Thought you might find this interesting. Frank looked at the screen and saw a background check on Nancy Peterson. It showed multiple complaints of harassment in different counties, 2 dropped fraud charges and a restraining order from a previous neighbor. Most interesting was her involvement in property development schemes in 3 different counties. She buys in early, drives surrounding property values down through harassment, then buys the land cheap for development, the sheriff explained. The HOA is just her latest cover. So this isn't just about keeping horses out of view of her precious subdivision? Frank asked. Sheriff Watts shook his head. Your 50 acres would make a nice expansion for Starlight Meadows. Very profitable. Is this legal? Frank asked. Barely, the sheriff said. Unethical for sure, but she's careful to stay just on the right side of the law. Until now. The false police report gives you leverage. Frank nodded slowly, pieces falling into place. Thank you for this information, Sheriff. Just doing my job, Sheriff Watts said, finishing his coffee. One law officer to another. We take care of our own around here. After the sheriff left, Frank sat thinking about what he had learned. Nancy Peterson wasn't just an annoying neighbor. She was running a scheme to force him off his land. But now he had evidence, and he knew exactly what to do with it. Frank spent the rest of the day making calls to old colleagues and searching for more information about Nancy Peterson and her development company. By evening, he had discovered that Starlight Meadows was just one of several developments she had created using the same tactics. In each case, she had forced out nearby landowners through harassment and intimidation, then bought their land at low prices. The next morning, Frank was surprised when his comm device buzzed with a message from Nancy Peterson herself. She wanted to meet to discuss their issues in a civilized manner. Frank agreed and suggested they meet at his property that afternoon. Nancy arrived, exactly on time, her hover SUV gleaming in the sun. She was wearing an expensive business suit and looked confident as she approached his porch. Mr. Miller, she said with a tight smile. Thank you for agreeing to meet. I think we got off on the wrong foot. That's one way to put it, Frank replied, not offering her a seat. What can I do for you, Ms. Peterson? Nancy's smile didn't reach her eyes. I wanted to talk about your situation. The HOA board has reconsidered our offer. We're now willing to pay 30% above market value for your property. That's very generous. It is, Frank agreed. But I'm still not selling. Nancy's smile faltered. Mr. Miller, be reasonable. This doesn't have to be difficult. You're right, Frank said. It doesn't. All you have to do is leave me alone and let me live on my property in peace. Nancy's face hardened. That's not going to happen. Your rural activities are incompatible with our community standards. I've been meaning to ask you about that, Frank said casually. How exactly does Starlight Development LLC work? That's your company, right? Hidden behind 3 shell companies? The color drained from Nancy's face. I don't know what you're talking about. I think you do, Frank continued. You've used the same pattern in 5 different counties. Buy land, build a development, create an HOA that you control, then harass neighboring property owners until they sell to you at a low price. Then you expand your development and make a huge profit. Nancy's eyes narrowed. You can't prove any of that. Actually, I can, Frank said. I was a detective for 15 years, Ms. Peterson. Did you really think I wouldn't investigate who I was dealing with? I have records of your property dealings in every county you've operated in. I have witness statements from people you've harassed, and now I have a documented case of you filing a false police report, which is a felony. Nancy tried to look confident, but Frank could see the fear in her eyes. What do you want? It's simple, Frank said. You're going to leave me alone completely. No complaints, no inspectors, no harassment. My horses and I will live in peace. And if I don't, Nancy challenged, though her voice trembled slightly. Then I send everything I have to the county prosecutor, Frank said calmly. My former colleagues at Galactic Security would also be very interested in your financial arrangements with those investors from Proxima Centauri, the ones you didn't report to Earth authorities. Nancy's eyes widened. How did you know about that? Frank smiled. I didn't, but thanks for confirming it. It was an old detective trick. Mention something specific but vague, and guilty people often filled in the details themselves. Nancy had just admitted to illegal off-world financial dealings which were under federal jurisdiction. Nancy stood very still, her mind clearly racing as she considered her options. Finally, she spoke in a quiet voice. What are your terms? Like I said, leave me alone, Frank repeated. And I want something in writing saying that my property is exempt from any community guidelines or restrictions from Starlight Meadows, now and in the future. Have your lawyer draw it up and bring it to me tomorrow. And then you'll keep quiet about everything else? Nancy asked. Frank nodded. As long as you keep your end of the deal. But if I have even one more problem with you or your HOA, everything I have goes to the authorities. Nancy stared at him for a long moment, then turned and walked back to her vehicle without another word. As she drove away, Frank allowed himself a small smile. He had faced down corrupt officials across the galaxy. Nancy Peterson had never stood a chance. That evening, Frank sat on his porch and watched the sunset. For the first time since moving in, he felt truly at peace. He had used his skills as a detective to protect his new home, just as he had protected countless people during his career. His comm device buzzed with a message from Sheriff Watts. Heard Peterson paid you a visit today. Everything okay? Frank smiled as he typed his reply. Everything's fine. I think we've come to an understanding. The sheriff's response came quickly. Good to hear. Let me know if you need anything else. Frank put down his device and looked out at his land, imagining how it would look with horses grazing in the fields. Tomorrow he would get back to building his stable without interruptions. His retirement could finally begin for real. In the distance, he could see the lights of Starlight Meadows coming on as darkness fell, but they no longer seemed like a threat, just neighbors keeping their distance as it should be. The next morning, Frank woke up feeling better than he had in weeks. He made coffee and went out to his porch to watch the sunrise. The air was clean and fresh, and birds were singing in the trees. For the first time since moving to Earth, he felt like this place was truly his home. After breakfast, Frank went back to work on his stable. Without constant interruptions from county inspectors, he made good progress. By noon, he had finished setting the support posts for the structure. He was just taking a break for lunch when a black hover car pulled into his driveway. A woman in a business suit stepped out carrying a folder. She wasn't Nancy Peterson, but looked like a professional of some kind. Mr. Miller? She called. I'm Laura Bennett, Ms. Peterson's attorney. I have the documents you requested. Frank invited her onto the porch and offered her a glass of water, which she accepted. Ms. Peterson asked me to deliver this to you, Laura said, handing him the folder. It's a legal agreement stating that your property is exempt from all Starlight Meadows HOA guidelines and restrictions now and in the future. It's been filed with the county land office as well. Frank read through the document carefully. It seemed legitimate and covered everything he had asked for. He signed his copy and handed it back to the lawyer. Ms. Peterson also asked me to give you this, Laura said, passing him a sealed envelope. She said it's a personal apology. Frank raised his eyebrows in surprise. He hadn't expected that. He opened the envelope and found a short note from Nancy, apologizing for her behavior and promising to respect his property rights going forward. Please tell Ms. Peterson I accept her apology, Frank said. As long as she keeps her end of our agreement, she has nothing to worry about from me. After the lawyer left, Frank went back to work with renewed energy. Over the next few weeks, he finished building his stable without any more problems from Nancy Peterson or the Starlight Meadows HOA. No more inspectors showed up at his door, and no more complaints were filed against him. Word spread quickly around town about how Frank had stood up to Nancy Peterson When he went into town for supplies, people would nod and smile at him. Sometimes they would stop to chat and thank him for standing up to the HOA. "You're the first person who hasn't backed down," Pete at the hardware store told him. "Nancy's been running this county like her private kingdom for years. It's good to see someone put her in her place." Frank just shrugged. "I didn't do anything special, just stood my ground." 1 month after his confrontation with Nancy, Frank's stable was complete. It was a solid structure with 4 stalls, a tack room, and a small storage area for feed. Now, he needed horses to fill it. He visited a horse ranch about 50 miles away and found exactly what he was looking for: 4 beautiful horses that needed new homes. There was a strong black stallion named Thunder, a gentle brown mare called Daisy, and 2 younger horses named Star and Shadow. The ranch owner was happy to sell them to Frank when he explained about his new stable. "These are good horses," the owner said. "They deserve a good home." Frank arranged for the horses to be transported to his property the following week. When they arrived, he felt a satisfaction he hadn't experienced in years. Watching the horses explore their new home, running free in his fields, made all the trouble with Nancy Peterson worth it. As the horses settled in, Frank noticed something interesting. People from Starlight Meadows would drive by his property slowly, stopping to watch the horses. Some even parked on the road and got out to get a better look. Far from being upset about the animals, they seemed to enjoy seeing them. One evening, as Frank was brushing Thunder in the field near the road, a car stopped and a family got out. A mother, father, and 2 small children stood by the fence watching. "Excuse me," the father called. "Would it be okay if the kids looked at your horses?" Frank nodded and led Thunder over to the fence. The children's eyes widened with wonder as they reached out to pet the horse's nose. "I've never seen a real horse before," the little girl said. "Only in videos." Frank realized that many Earth people, especially those who lived in fancy developments, like Starlight Meadows, had never been close to farm animals. To his surprise, he found himself enjoying showing the children how to feed carrots to Thunder and explaining how to care for horses. After that day, more families started stopping by to see the horses. Frank set up regular times when visitors could come and learn about the animals. He even built a small viewing area with benches where people could sit and watch the horses grazing. 3 months after his confrontation with Nancy Peterson, Frank received a message from Sheriff Watts asking if they could meet. The sheriff arrived that afternoon looking amused. "Thought you might want to know," he said as they sat on Frank's porch. "Nancy Peterson has sold her interest in Starlight Meadows and moved away. Said she had health issues, but word is she's under investigation for tax fraud related to her off-world investments." Frank nodded but didn't comment. He hadn't reported Nancy to the authorities. He had kept his side of the bargain. But someone else must have gotten wind of her activities. "Also," the sheriff continued, "the new president of the Starlight Meadows HOA came to see me yesterday. Guy named Greg Butler. He wanted to know if you'd be willing to let the development organize regular visits to see your horses. Seems the residents have been asking for it." Frank laughed. "From trying to run me off to asking for field trips, that's quite a change." "People like your horses," Sheriff Watts said, "and they respect that you stood up to Nancy. Not many would have had the courage or the skills to do what you did." After the sheriff left, Frank went out to the fields to check on his horses. They were grazing peacefully as the sun began to set. In the distance, he could see the houses of Starlight Meadows, no longer seeming like an enemy camp, but just another part of the landscape. His comm device buzzed with a message from an old colleague from Galactic Security. "How's retirement treating you? Any excitement?" Frank smiled as he typed his reply. "Just the usual. Even on Earth, there are battles to fight and peace to keep. But I've got it under control. Life is good here. I've got my land, my horses, and even the neighbors are coming around. Turns out people everywhere, even in fancy developments, still appreciate simple things like watching horses run free." He sent the message and put the device away. Then he leaned on the fence and watched his horses until the stars came out. The same stars he had traveled among for 30 years were now just a beautiful backdrop to his peaceful ranch life. Frank looked up at the night sky and smiled. He had found his place in the universe, right here on Earth where his ancestors had come from. And he had defended it, just as he had defended justice across the galaxy during his career. Some battles were worth fighting, even in retirement.